Impact Dialogues, a podcast by the ERC-funded research project Populism and Conspiracy Theory.
Welcome to another episode in the podcast series Impact Dialogues. In this specific series, I talk to my colleagues in the project on populism and conspiracy theory and ask them about their insights and findings after working in the project for several years. So I'm very pleased that my guest today is Katerina Hatzikidi, who is an anthropologist and who has been a postdoc researcher with the PACT project from the very beginning until the very end. So she and I are the veterans in the project. And she's a specialist on Brazil. And this is also what she studied. But Katerina, to zoom in right away, what exactly did you look at in Brazil?
Michael, thanks so much for having me. So what I did was to look at the conservative voters in Brazil. Conservative in the way that they self-identify, right? Most critics would probably describe them as far-right voters or conspiracy theorists in many cases as well. But my interest was in those people who now defend that the election of 2022, the presidential election, was stolen. And therefore, the government of Lula da Silva, the ongoing government in Brazil, was illegitimate. And that in reality, President Bolsonaro had won the election. So I began by asking that because there was so much written and so much done on the last decade in Brazil. There was so much written on the conservative movement, the rise of the far right, and Bolsonarismo in particular. But there were not really ethnographic studies of that movement. And I wanted to talk to these people to better understand what they were thinking, how they see the world. And this is also because when Lula finished his second term back in 2010, his popularity had been reported to be over 80%. So when Lula left his second government, he was a widely popular leader. And it appeared by polls at the time he was in prison in 2018 when Bolsonaro got elected that had he been able to run for president, he would also have been elected back then. So one of the questions that actually made me very interested in studying the conservative movement was how did a majority of Brazilians went from being very supportive of Lula to now believing that Lula stole the presidential elections and he was capable of actually becoming a dictator, as many of my interlocutors described him. So I was very curious to study this major shift in how Lula and politics more broadly in Brazil were perceived by a segment of the population.
Well, maybe before I ask you for the explanations that you have come up with, let me first ask you how you found your interlocutors. So I'm a literary critic, so I'm always fascinated by people who do ethnographic work and to actually talk to real people and not only study texts. So how does one do that? Do you take a plane to Rio de Janeiro and then you just talk to people in the streets, or how does one do that?
Well, yeah, that's pretty much what happened, to be honest. So I've been working in Brazil for over a decade now. I did my first long-term ethnographic research in Eastern Amazon in Maranhão state. So it was a rural area, and I worked with quilombolas. So it was a very different context, but that was kind of my first long-term study, ethnographic study, which went on for about 2 years, actually. And I've been studying Brazil ever since. So for this study, I did go to Rio de Janeiro, as you said, and I was also expecting to find some difficulty finding interlocutors because most of my friends and acquaintances in Brazil were not Bolsonaristas, right, at the time. So I was also curious to find out whether it would be hard. And I was initially expecting it to be the case, but then I was surprised at how easy it was for me to find people to talk to. And I think that part of the reason that this was the case was that as a foreigner, people would not be immediately suspicious of me and would not be immediately able to put me in a box in a sense of being able to identify my political, where do I stand politically, right? So it was actually very easy and people were very eager to talk to me. I felt like there was a need on their part to actually share the story, to share their thoughts. And coming from a German university also helped lend legitimacy to my research study. So when I was telling them that I was interested in studying polarization and the political context and the conservative side of the political tension, people were genuinely interested in helping out and were not really questioning my intentions or, how is the study was going to affect them in a negative way. So this didn't really come up.
Did you tell them that you were studying conspiracy theories?
Yeah, that was part of what I was studying, and I told them that. So it was not a problem, and people were really open. I mean, of course, it's Brazil. People are nice generally. But yeah, not seeing me as a threat, as a political enemy, let's say, was immensely helpful. And as you said, so it was finding people casually and accidentally, and then from the first few interlocutors through snowballing effect, getting to new interlocutors. At some point, I didn't have the time to talk to all the people that were available to talk to me. So I'm very grateful for that.
So you said that the people you studied were supporters of Bolsonaro, people who think the 2022 election was stolen. Can you tell us a bit more about these people? And I assume, were they in a way all the same, coming from the same class? Was there a gender bias, or was this really something are these ideas that are spread across a whole spectrum of social classes, incomes, and that women subscribe to just as well as men?
Yeah, so Bolsonaro's support is really broad. There is a small concentration of his support in the southern states of Brazil, which also tend to be wealthier and whiter than the rest of the country. But one would be wrong to say that there is a strong demographic bias in the population that supports Bolsonaro. And so much so, of course, that nearly half of the voting population voted for Bolsonaro. So this is a very big number, and it's not contained in any specific age or gender or economic group or even geographic group. But yeah, broadly speaking, Lula did get a higher percentage of the vote in the northeastern states, which have historically been less wealthy and less white than the southern states, where Bolsonaro got a higher percentage of the vote.
And why would you say that's the case? Why does Bolsonaro appeal to all kinds of voters, even though there are certain areas where he's more popular than in others? But he seems to enjoy fairly broad support all over the country and from very different groups of the population.
Yeah, so I think some of the criticisms Bolsonaro brings to the fore resonate with people across the board. So people living in favelas in Rio, for instance, who also tend to vote for Bolsonaro, support many of his policies and ideas. And when he talks about, for instance, against assistentialism, what he calls assistentialism, so the state of social securities and conditional income based on need, which one would imagine that perhaps people who do benefit from these policies might reject someone who speaks negatively of them. It does resonate with them because they also, many of them see themselves as middle class people who would benefit from an open market, neoliberal policies that would allow them to grow economically and socially. So, for instance, Uber drivers in Brazil very commonly describe themselves as entrepreneurs and as the bosses of themselves, basically. They don't see themselves necessarily as precarious workers with no guaranteed rights, but they see themselves as, managers of their own time, with the potential to grow and become, part of the middle class. So this is just one example to say that a lot of the appeal comes from places that one wouldn't necessarily expect in the first place. But also, very importantly, Bolsonaro grew as a political figure because he has been a federal lawmaker. Before he became president, he was a federal lawmaker for more than 20 years. So he's a person with a long history in Brazilian politics. He didn't come out of the blue, but he grew because in the early 2010, and specifically in 2013, there was a broad discontent with the government of the Workers' Party, the PT, which is the Lula's party, and the former President Dilma Rousseff's party. And there was broad discontent from the population that initially in 2013, there was no direct partidarian or even political association. There was just broad discontent out of the economic crisis that was rising at the time, and also some corruption scandals that came out and really created shockwaves at the population. And these discontent was translated into massive street demonstrations, right, that went on for a long time. And these street demonstrations were eventually captured by the right. And Bolsonaro really emerged as a main political figure in the years that followed 2013. And then he was able to channel broad discontent into specific political expression that he was leading, right? So in a way, it was a reaction to the years of the PT administration. So he managed to portray himself as the answer to a corrupt, supposedly corrupt, and failed administration.
Now, a term that you haven't used yet is, of course, populism. So is the Bolsonaro movement a populist movement? If so, in what ways? And can we think of Bolsonaro as a kind of populist leader, even though he is very much an establishment figure? You just outlined his history before he became president.
Right. So you could say that Bolsonaro has characteristics of a populist leader. He does talk about o povo, the people, a lot, and he is supposed to be the voice of the people. He's a charismatic leader, and there have been instances during his career where, especially in the last years, where he has also showed this martyric element, so the leader who sacrifices for his people. And this is especially present at the moment, but we could also see it when he was stabbed during his political campaign in 2018, and images of him, being next to Jesus and almost dying for the people to save the country and the people were very strong at the time. And of course, now that supposedly there is political persecution against him, and he's currently with an ankle monitor and he has to stay at home for most of the day, not able to use social media. This is also, his campaign also portrays this as the leader being sacrificed for his people. But Bolsonaro, more than populist, I would say what is stronger in Bolsonaro is his nationalism. Bolsonaro has a military past. He was a captain at the time. He was forced to resign from the armed forces, and he has had a very long relationship with the armed forces, which, of course, he also brought to his administration. His vice president was a general. The vice president in his ticket for the 2022 presidential elections was also an army general. Members of his administration were active or non-active members of the armed forces. In fact, there were more military personnel in his administration than in the dictatorship that lasted from 1964 to 1985 in Brazil. So there was a very strong association of Bolsonaro as a man of the armed forces. And historically in Brazil, especially among the more conservative population, there is a very positive connotation when someone talks about the armed forces. The ideas of excellence, of discipline, of respect to hierarchy and order are very prevalent and shape a very positive image of what people who are educated in this military environment can bring to society. So Bolsonaro was positively viewed by many of his voters also because of his military past. And he himself, of course, always brought this to the forefront, and he spoke very fondly of his time in the armed forces, but also of the military dictatorship. So what we saw during his government was also a resurfacing of a very positive evaluation of that moment of Brazil's history, which for a long time, ever since democratization and the 1988 constitution, it was not really part of public discourse. And during the administration of Bolsonaro, we saw an officialization of a narrative about the dictatorship that was very positive. So he really brought back ideas about the nation, the body of the nation, so the people, but also the nation and its symbolism, like its flag and its armed forces. He really brought them to the center of his politics.
Before we continue this conversation about Bolsonaro and his movement, the question that comes to my mind here is then, why then is Bolsonaro so often labeled a populist? And of course, one of the reasons why, when I did the application for this project, that I picked Brazil was that everybody in the media was talking about Bolsonaro as a populist.
Yeah, so as I said, Bolsonaro is also a populist, and especially, not just what I described before, as him as a charismatic leader, the idea of the sacrifice for the people. He's also talking about the people a lot, but most importantly, perhaps, there is a very strong division between us and them. So this kind of sharp dichotomy between us conservatives, which, of course, in the conservative imaginary, it equals the good citizens, morally upright, God-fearing, essentially Christian, but it's not meant to be exclusive of other religions, but a Christian element is really central to the idea of a conservative in Brazil. And us, so the good taxpayers, to reduce it and put it very simply, and the others being the corrupt communists, essentially. So there's a whole construction of the PT administration and its followers as corrupt individuals, people who are not interested in the good of the country, are not invested in the common good, but want its destruction. And so if they are elected, it will just be the end of the nation, the end of the country, and we should prevent them from doing that. Of course, there is a lot to say about the historical construction of left politics as communist and the idea of communism as an intrinsic evil, as something that is foreign to Brazilians and foreign to any ideas of nationhood, but also essentially destructive. And Bolsonaro really grew out of this dichotomy, right? And this dichotomy really resonated for different reasons. As I mentioned earlier, the context was especially propitious because there was a very broad social discontent against the PT administration. And to say at that moment, that they were corrupt and unable to govern, it really resonated with a lot of people. And this really helped create this kind of us and them dichotomy, which I think is very central for Bolsonaro. So in this sense, he really is a populist. I just wanted to say that he's not just a populist. He's also very much of a nationalist, yeah.
And maybe this is something we haven't talked about yet. He is also a conspiracy theorist, right? I mean, you hinted at ideas about communism in Brazil, so maybe that's the gateway for us to talk about the other big concept that was driving our project, and that is, of course, belief in conspiracy theories. So in what ways does this play a role for the people who support Bolsonaro, and in which ways does he foster to their needs, so to say, in that regard?
Right. So there are different conspiracy theories that circulate. And one of them, perhaps the most central, the most influential in the last years, has been that of an electoral fraud. So Bolsonaro, during his time in government as president, he started circulating, talking about the idea that the electronic ballot system is not reliable and that Brazil cannot have clean elections relying exclusively on the electronic ballot system. And he proposed a print receipt so that each voter would then get a print receipt of his vote as a proof that, his vote had been validated. And he proposed this, and there was a voting in Congress which was rejected at the time. So the Congress did not agree to the print ballot. And there is, broad agreement that there is nothing wrong with the electronic ballot system. And Bolsonaro actually, since he is now accused of attempting a coup, of leading a criminal organization that was planning a coup d'etat, he has now denied allegations of propelling conspiracy theories or fake news against the electronic ballot system. What he now says is that he was just raising questions that are normal and healthy in a democratic system, and he was just wanting to make sure that the elections would be legitimate. But the idea of an election that was not 100% safe or 100% accurate really gave rise to widespread suspicions of the result. And one of the more tangible results of this suspicion was the January 8th invasion of the Three Powers Plaza in Brasilia, where supporters of President Bolsonaro invaded the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the seat of the presidency, essentially calling for a military intervention, a coup d'etat, because they defended that Lula is a non-legitimate president. The elections were rigged, they were stolen, and Bolsonaro should return to the presidency after the armed forces took temporarily over to call for new elections, which they were sure Bolsonaro would definitely win with no tampering by the opposition. So there are different conspiracy theories circulating. And you can say that it has been important for the Bolsonaro movement as well.
So maybe before I follow up on that, I'm struck by the parallels between Brazil and the United States. So if we change a couple of the names and dates, you could be describing Donald Trump, it seems to me. Do you think Bolsonaro has been self-consciously modeling himself after Trump, or is this just a coincidence?
Well, there are strong connections, and they are very evident ones too. I mean, Bolsonaro never hid his admiration for Trump, and we know that they have met on several occasions. But there is also a broad affinity, let's say, with the conservative movement in Brazil and conservatives in the US, but also elsewhere in the world. We know that they regularly meet in CPAC meetings and other occasions. And there is a sort of, let's get organized, let's talk to each other, let's see what, how we can mutually benefit from cooperation. Of course, more than that, there is this idea of the US as, among conservatives, as an exemplar state, as the example to be followed. So there is a lot in common, although it would be unfair to just reduce this, what Bolsonaro is, in just a resemblance of Trump. There are many things that are different, as I mentioned also earlier. So I wouldn't like to reduce Bolsonaro to just the image of Trump.
Yeah, that was a bit of a provocative question. That's why I asked it. Obviously, there are these differences. Now, we started by talking about the people who support Bolsonaro, and now we've talked for a long while about Bolsonaro himself. So let's maybe circle back to the people that you talk to, your interlocutors, and their relationship to conspiracy theories. Did they articulate conspiracy theories when they were talking to you? Was your impression that they believe these conspiracy theories, or are there maybe other reasons for them to voice them?
Yeah, so they were very present. Different conspiracy theories were very present in my conversations with my interlocutors. It's difficult to say to what degree each of them believed in a specific conspiracy theory. Of course, this, I think, is something that varies a lot and can change over time. And there are different degrees and intensities of belief or questioning. I think, and as we talk about in the last episode of this podcast series, there is a general tendency to go along with a given conspiracy theory, even if someone may have doubts or questions or not fully embrace it, but go along with it if you still defend the populist leader, for instance. So if you still think Bolsonaro is the better option, then you might as well accept something that you don't fully subscribe to. But I would say that my overall impression is that people were genuinely concerned about some of the issues raised by conspiracy theories. And they were genuinely preoccupied. So, for instance, gender ideology was something that always came up in the conversations. People appeared to be genuinely worried about what happens at schools, what happens with their children. And there was this whole fear about, my child goes to school and they're being taught that they can be anything they want. They can be a woman or a man or a plant. So this was disconcerting for many of my interlocutors. And there were, of course, other problems, especially located in education, that they identified, such as, a supposedly Gramscian-style indoctrination that would be including in the curricula subversive ideas about the world, and they would teach Marx to 8-year-olds, and they would try to capture them from a very early age and turn them into communists. And this was a preoccupation because the idea was that they turn kids against their own parents. And of course, it also has to do with Christian values and Christian beliefs. So the fear of indoctrinating children to become atheists and remove them from the values of their parents was very present. And this is just one example. So the concerns were very present. And if I have to sum up, I would say that they seemed pretty genuine.
How did you feel when your interlocutors made these claims, which I'm pretty sure are mostly wrong, about children being taught that they can be a plant and Marxism being told to 7-year-olds? How does one deal with this as an anthropologist? Is there a kind of itch to correct them, or do you just smile and nod and do a lot of thinking?
Yeah, so I am not condescending, and I wasn't there to correct them, really. I could, and I often did, have disagreements with them, and I would often challenge them to consider or to realize the inconsistencies in our conversation. So there were these moments of, maybe this is not entirely true. What about this? And I would bring other examples, and they would consider them, but I don't think it would really change the way they saw things. And my role wasn't really there to make them aware of how wrong they were. But I would definitely listen, and I would try to understand where did this come from. So to go back to the beginning of our conversation, almost all of my interlocutors, with the exception of one, had voted for Lula at least once in the past. So these are people who have had a very different idea of who Lula was in the past and what his administration was capable of doing. And one of the things that I understood by talking to them is that there was a very profound frustration with what Lula's administrations had done to the country. So the reading was that they had brought about very damaging effects. These damaging effects were initially only situated in the economy and the corruption scandals, but then were transferred to all areas of their activity. So it had profound social effects. So the idea that if they were capable of this, they are also capable of that. There was this kind of idea that nothing is off limits. So if they are evil in one area, they are also capable of causing harm to our kids at school and maybe ban religious, like close churches and persecute the opposition and really bring about a totalitarian regime, as many feared. So, yeah, there was a kind of leap in the thought of, if they were corrupt, economically corrupt, they are also morally corrupt, right? There was a very direct association between the two forms of corruption as commonly understood.
Now, to broaden the perspective as we're approaching the end a little bit, one of the things that we've seen in this project through our different case studies is that the status, that is the acceptance of conspiracy theories, differs widely from country to country. So in Germany, conspiracy theories are still extremely stigmatized and therefore marginalized, very much the same, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, seems to be happening in Italy, whereas in Poland and Hungary, conspiracy theories are completely accepted in the mainstream as a legitimate form of knowledge. How would you say, based on your observations, is the status of conspiracy theories in Brazil these days? And would you say it has changed over time, or has it always been like that?
It's hard to tell, really. I think it depends a lot on demographics, but I would say that a lot of things can be said openly. So a lot of conspiracy theories can be talked about perhaps more openly than elsewhere. But there are also certain things that are not really tolerated. So for instance, anti-Semitism was very present in the conspiracy theories that were prevalent in the 30s and 40s, but it's not really part of conspiracist rhetoric at the moment, and it hasn't been for a very long time. So it's really not acceptable. It's not something that people can feel free to talk about openly. So, for instance, with regards to the conspiracy theories around the 2022 election, people were actually feeling comfortable to make wide accusations and in a very unlimited manner, and some things that would appear outlandish were openly said without any problem. But also, I just want to say that this was not just among my interlocutors from who were Bolsonaro supporters, but very casually in conversations with people who were supporting the PT, I would hear things like, yeah, the January 8th invasion was an inside job, but which is something Bolsonaristas accuse the PT administration of actually, simulating an invasion that would look bad on them, on the Bolsonaristas. So I heard people from the left saying that, yeah, I think it was an inside job, but that's great that they did it, because it had to end somehow. So there are different conspiracy theories circulating, and there are different degrees of acceptance. It's very debatable, I would say the least.
Everything that we have talked about, of course, will be explained in more detail in your book, which is forthcoming with Routledge next year and which will be published under the title Conservatism and Conspiracism in Brazil. Do you feel you're done now with conspiracism and populism, or are there other projects that you have in mind that you might pursue in the future?
Yeah, I feel that this is a field that is very rich and very interesting to me personally, but also very important to study. Still understudied not only in Brazil, but also in other South American countries. I think this is something that I would really like to continue working on. It's a phenomenon that is, in some ways, it is growing or it's resurfacing at the moment. And I think it's important to understand its dimensions. It's important to understand its influence, whether on public policy and legislation or on vernacular ideas about democracy. So how people's ideas about democracy are being influenced and shaped by conspiracy theories. And yeah, I would definitely like to continue studying this. I think it's really fascinating.
And we're looking forward to learning about your results then. Thank you so much for talking to me today and sharing your insights about the connection between populism and conspiracism and conservatism in Brazil. Thank you, Katerina Hatzikidi, and goodbye.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Impact Dialogues. This podcast is part of the project Populism and Conspiracy Theory, funded by the European Research Council. Host, Professor Michael Butter. Production, Julius Haferkorn with C4 Studio.